A room full of alien commanders laughed at him. 47 of them, different species, different uniforms, different ways of expressing contempt, and every single one of them dismissed him without a second thought. By the end of that same week, without a single order being given, every one of them would rise to their feet for him. Not because they were told to, because they finally understood what they had been looking at all along. This is how that happened. The laughter started before he finished speaking. It wasn't loud at first, just a few scattered sounds, the kind people make when they think something is mildly amusing but not worth fully reacting to. Then it spread, picked up, gained confidence. By the time Aaron Vale lowered his hand from the display panel, the entire chamber had shifted. What had been a room of disciplined cadets moments ago had become something looser, something sharper, something that felt, in the quiet of his chest, like standing in cold water up to the neck. 47 of them sat in curved tiers around the central platform. Different species, different uniforms, different ways of expressing amusement, but all aligned in one thing. They did not take him seriously. Aaron stood still at the center. The projection behind him faded, leaving only a dim outline of the terrain he had been describing. A narrow ridge, a broken defensive line, a decision made under pressure. He had practiced the explanation carefully, not to impress, but to be clear. Every variable accounted for, every movement justified. It had mattered to him that it was accurate. It clearly did not matter to them. No aerial support, one of the Draven cadets said, leaning back with a slow, grinding chuckle. You're saying your entire outcome depended on ground positioning. Another voice followed immediately. And manual coordination? This one sharper, almost curious but edged with disbelief. No neural link? No predictive assist? Aaron shook his head once. No. That was when the laughter became real. It rolled through the chamber in waves. Not cruel in the obvious sense. No one stood up to mock him directly. No one raised their voice. It was worse than that. It was casual, effortless. The kind of reaction that required no intention because it came from a shared assumption, one so firmly established in this room that it didn't even need to be stated aloud. This is not impressive. Aaron let the silence return on its own. He didn't rush to fill it, didn't try to defend the story or expand it into something larger. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, waiting for the room to settle back into something resembling order. Inside, there was a familiar weight settling into place, not shame, not defeat. Something steadier than both of those things. Something that had been pressed and hammered into shape over a very long time. He had felt this before. He knew what it was. At the front row, Commander Reth Vorn watched him with mild interest. For eyes, all focused, all measuring. Vorn had spoken earlier. His presentation had been precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. A coordinated orbital suppression campaign that had ended a conflict in under 6 hours. No losses on his side. Total collapse on the other. That was what this room respected. Efficiency. Scale. Superiority. Aaron's story had none of those things, at least not in a way they recognized. Cadet Vale. The instructor said from the elevated platform near the far wall, her voice calm but carrying easily across the chamber. Is that the entirety of your example? Aaron nodded. Yes. A pause. Not long, but enough. Very well, she said. You may return to your position. He stepped down from the center without hesitation. As he passed the second row, a cadet made a quiet sound, not directed at him specifically, but close enough that it might as well have been. Another cadet whispered something that caused a brief ripple of amusement among the three beside them. 2 rows ahead, a cadet leaned toward their neighbor with the particular confidence of someone who believed they could not be heard. Manual defense of a fixed position. 11 hours. A quiet pause. Then, that's basic. The word hung in the air for a second before dissolving. Basic. Aaron didn't look. He didn't react. He reached his place along the outer curve of the chamber and sat down, placing his data slate flat against the desk in front of him. His movements were unhurried, precise, as if the reaction around him had not altered anything at all. But his jaw was set. His eyes were forward and very still. And somewhere beneath the composure, something old and quiet pressed against the inside of his ribs like a hand against a door. To his right, a human cadet leaned slightly closer. You're just going to leave it like that? The cadet asked under his breath. Aaron kept his eyes forward. There's nothing to add. They think. I know what they think. The other cadet exhaled sharply but didn't press further. He leaned back, arms crossing, the tension in his posture obvious even in stillness. At the center, the next presentation had already begun. Commander Reth Vorn stood where Aaron had been moments before, called forward to elaborate on a point from his earlier demonstration. He didn't need the projection this time. He spoke without it, which somehow made the room lean in more. When you remove uncertainty, Vorn said, his voice steady, controlled, you remove resistance. Conflict is not won by force alone. It is won by ensuring the opposing side has no viable path forward. A series of data points appeared briefly above his wrist, then vanished again. He didn't look at them. I engaged 3 separate command structures simultaneously, he continued. Each one believed they were responding to a different threat vector. By the time they realized the pattern, their coordination had already collapsed. There was no reaction at first. Then, slowly, heads nodded. Understanding. Respect. A Draven cadet in the front row spoke without raising their hand. You created false realities for each command tier. Vorn inclined his head slightly. Yes. How long did it take them to realize? They didn't, Vorn said. Not in time to matter. That landed. You could feel it move through the room. This was the standard. Not survival. Control. Precision. Dominance at scale. Aaron watched the exchange without shifting in his seat. He listened. He followed the logic. He noted the precision of the execution and the elegance of the outcome. It was impressive. There was no denying that. But it was also distant. Abstract in a way his story had not been. Then the instructor's voice cut across the chamber. Cadet Cell. Yara Cell moved to the center with the kind of presence that required no announcement. Tall, composed, every movement measured down to its smallest detail. Her species had a way of holding stillness that made it feel intentional. Like even the absence of motion carried meaning. Her projection activated in layers. Not one display, but many. Fleet formations appeared first, then dissolved into something more abstract. Patterns of influence. Neural mapping overlays. Psychological pressure points mapped across entire command hierarchies. I will not be presenting a battle, Yara said. That alone was enough to shift the room. I will be presenting a conclusion. She raised one hand slightly. The projection shifted again. 600 vessels. Not arranged for combat. Arranged in uncertainty. These ships were neutralized without engagement, she said. No weapons were fired. No direct command interference was initiated. A pause. Then how? Someone asked quietly. Yara's gaze moved across the room once before settling forward again. I introduced a unified perception. The projection sharpened. Each command vessel lit up in sequence, then simultaneously. They all experienced the same outcome, she continued. A complete and irreversible defeat. Not predicted, not simulated. Experienced. The silence that followed was different from before. Not admiration. Something closer to unease. They stood down, Yara said. Not because they were ordered to. Because continuing ceased to be a rational action. The projection faded. No one laughed. No one shifted in their seat. Even Vorn watched her with a level of attention he had not given the others. That, Yara finished, is control. She stepped back. The response came slower this time, but it came deeper. Not a ripple. A wait. At the back of the chamber, near the elevated seating where the lighting dimmed slightly and the attention of the room rarely lingered, someone sat alone. Aaron had noticed him before. He was certain of it now, though he couldn't remember exactly when the certainty had arrived. The man was older. Not in the way of the instructors or the administrative observers who occasionally attended these sessions. Older in a way that didn't try to present itself as anything else. The uniform was plain, gray. No visible insignia beyond a small set of markings near the collar that were too subtle to read from this distance. The posture was relaxed, almost casual, one arm resting along the edge of the seat, as if the entire setting required very little from him. He was not watching Yarosel. He was watching the room, not with interest, not with judgment, simply observing, as if what was happening in front of him was deeply familiar, as if he had seen this particular performance before, in different rooms, across different years, and had long since stopped needing to react to it. For a brief second, his gaze shifted. It met Aaron's. There was no expression there, no approval, no sympathy, nothing that could be easily defined, just a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. the kind that passes between people who recognize something in each other that most of the room cannot see. Then he looked away. The session continued. The room absorbed it. And somewhere at the back of that chamber, in the quiet space where no one was looking, something had already begun. The session ended without ceremony. Chairs shifted. Conversations resumed in low, controlled tones. Groups formed and dissolved with the natural ease of people who understood their place in a hierarchy and moved within it without needing instruction. Aaron remained seated for a moment longer than most. Not because he had anything to say, because he preferred the space after. The noise thinned as cadets filtered out in clusters, their discussions already narrowing into familiar patterns. Analysis, comparison, quiet reinforcement of what had just been established. No one approached him. That, too, was expected. He stood eventually, collecting his data slate, and moved toward the exit along the outer curve of the room. The path was clear, not intentionally made so, but naturally avoided. People adjusted their trajectories without thinking about it, conversations continuing uninterrupted as he passed. He was used to that particular kind of invisibility. It had its own texture, its own weight. By the time he stepped into the corridor, the hum of the chamber had faded behind him. The hallway outside was wide and softly lit, designed for transition rather than gathering. Most cadets moved through it quickly, heading toward their next assignments. Aaron slowed. Not enough to stand out, just enough to let the flow pass around him. And then he stopped. Ahead, near the far end of the corridor where it opened toward the observation wing, someone stood alone. The same man. The gray uniform caught the light differently out here, its simplicity more noticeable against the clean lines of the station walls. No decorations, no visible rank beyond those small, nearly indistinguishable markings near the collar. He was looking out through the observation panel, not moving, not checking a device, just standing. Aaron approached without deciding to. It wasn't a conscious choice, more like the absence of one. The distance closed gradually. The corridor emptied further. At some point, the background noise of passing cadets disappeared entirely, leaving only the quiet ambient hum of the station systems. The man didn't turn, but as Aaron came to a stop a few steps away, he spoke. You held the ridge longer than you needed to. His voice was calm, unforced, as if he were commenting on something already understood, something the two of them had both been thinking about for the last hour, without speaking a word. Aaron didn't answer immediately. You stayed after the objective was met, the man continued. Most would have withdrawn. Aaron glanced toward the observation panel, then back to him. The withdrawal window wasn't stable. No, the man said. It wasn't. A brief silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just present. The kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled. Aaron studied him more closely now. Up close, the details were clearer. The slight stiffness in his stance. The way his weight shifted subtly, compensating for something not immediately visible. The lines on his face that didn't come from age alone, but from time spent in environments where decisions had consequences that stayed with you long after the moment had passed. You were there, Aaron said. It wasn't a question. The man's gaze remained on the stars beyond the glass. Not that ridge. Another pause. But places like it. Aaron nodded once. That was enough. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the observation panel, distant points of light held their positions against the dark, unchanged by anything happening inside the station. You didn't correct them, Aaron said finally. The man's expression didn't shift. No, they misunderstood the outcome. Yes. Aaron let out a slow breath. That doesn't matter to you. The man considered that for a second. It matters. A slight turn of his head, just enough to acknowledge Aaron without fully facing him. It just doesn't require a response. Aaron absorbed that. Across the corridor, a group of cadets passed at a distance, voices low, attention elsewhere. None of them looked in this direction. Why? Aaron asked. The man's gaze returned fully to the observation panel. Because understanding isn't something you can give someone. The words were simple, delivered without emphasis. It arrives, he added after a moment. Or it doesn't. Aaron said nothing. The station lights reflected faintly against the glass, layering the interior over the vastness outside. For a second, he could see both at once, the contained, structured world of the academy and the open, indifferent scale beyond it. They think scale defines importance, Aaron said. They're not wrong, the man replied. Another pause. They're just not complete. That lingered. Aaron felt it settle somewhere deeper than the words themselves. After a while, the man shifted slightly, adjusting his stance. I should go, he said. Not as an obligation. As a simple statement. Aaron nodded. The man turned then, finally facing him fully. For the first time, there was something in his expression that resembled recognition. Not of rank, not of status. Of presence. You told the story correctly, he said. Then he walked past him. Unhurried. No expectation of response. Aaron remained where he was for a few seconds after, watching the direction he had gone until he disappeared around the curve of the corridor. There had been no introduction. No name. No indication of who he was within the structure of the station. And yet Aaron knew. Not in detail. Not in facts or records. But in the same way you recognize something fundamental without needing it explained. The way you know a fire is hot before anyone tells you. He turned back toward the observation panel. The stars hadn't changed. They never did. But something in the way he looked at them had. That night, in her quarters, Yarosel could not make her thoughts organize themselves. That had never happened before. Not like this. She lay still in the dim light, replaying the session in fragments that refused to arrange themselves into anything clean. Not the impressive presentations. That part had already been processed and filed. Not Vorn's precision, not her own. It was the inconsistency. A small thing. Persistent. The human cadet story had not matched the reaction it received. Not logically. The dismissal had been immediate, almost reflexive, and yet something about the structure of the account, about the decisions embedded in it, suggested a level of judgment that did not align with the word basic, no matter how confidently it had been delivered. And then there was the man in gray. Yara sat up. She did not deal well with unresolved variables. She reached for the slim terminal at the side of her bunk. The screen activated with a soft glow, and she entered a simple query. No assumptions. Just the name. The station's access logs had listed all attendees present in the training hall. It hadn't taken much to isolate the anomaly. An individual without clear designation, attached to the session without a defined role. The terminal processed, then returned results. Sparse. That was the first inconsistency. For someone of his apparent age, his presence within a coalition academy, his access level, the record was too thin. Not incomplete. Deliberately minimal. She opened the first entry. Early service record. Ground unit assignment. Outer sector deployment. Standard language. Standard formatting. Then she read the numbers. 12 personnel. Forward relay position. Hostile force. Estimated 300. Duration, 7 days. She read them again. Slowly. 12 against 300, holding a relay position for 7 full days without reinforcement. The math was not complicated. 300 divided by 12 was 25 to 1. Sustained over 168 hours, with rotational rest cycles to maintain operational capacity, which meant at no point did any individual among that 12 have more than 4 or 5 hours of uninterrupted rest across the entire engagement. The report did not describe heroism. It described resource allocation, structural modifications to defensive positions using available materials. Decisions. Calmly. Precisely. It ended with a single line. Unit maintained position until relief arrival. Casualties, minimal. Yara sat back slightly. That was not how most reports of that scale were written. There was no emphasis. No recognition. Just outcome. She moved to the next entry. A later engagement. Different location, different conditions. Again, the language remained controlled, almost clinical. A small unit. 8 personnel this time. Operating without communications support for the first 9 days of a 12-day deployment. Manual mapping of enemy movement patterns. A disruption executed at a precise choke point that caused cascading failure across multiple coordinated strikes aimed at coalition resupply lines. The cascading effect alone had delayed what intelligence records suggested would have been a 3-front offensive. An offensive that, had it succeeded, would have compromised supply capacity across 4 systems for an estimated 16 to 20 months. 8 people. No communications. 12 days. And a disruption that changed the shape of a war. Yara checked the classification marker at the top of the file. Restricted. Not fully sealed, but not widely distributed either. She accessed the third entry. It required additional clearance. Her terminal prompted for verification. She provided it. A brief delay. Then the file opened. Longer. Denser. More detailed. A civilian evacuation point. Structural failure in a primary access corridor. Manual override required. Time to restore automated systems. Unknown. Number of civilians awaiting evacuation. 3,214. Yara read slowly. One individual maintaining a structural breach point. Physically, with his own body used as a brace against a failing mechanism, while engineering teams worked to restore function in a different section of the system. The breach had required constant pressure and adjustment for the duration, because the structural stress was not static. It shifted. It changed. Every few minutes, the parameters of what was needed changed. Duration, 43 minutes. She read that line twice. Injury sustained in the first 11 minutes of the hold. No replacement available. No relief possible without compromising the breach point itself. Position maintained. Evacuation completed. 3,214 civilians. The report ended the same way the others had. No emphasis. No recognition. Just the result. Yara lowered the terminal slightly, her gaze unfocused for a moment. 3 entries. 3 different scenarios. All following the same pattern. Limited resources. Increasing pressure. Sustained decision-making over time, not in spite of the conditions, but because of them. As if the conditions themselves were the thing that had sharpened the choices, rather than the thing that had compromised them. She went back to the second report. Read the final assessment again. She ran the projection forward in her mind. The kind of projection she had used to neutralize 600 vessels without firing a single weapon. Supply lines compromised. Campaign extension estimated at 11 to 14 months. Casualty increase across 4 systems over that period. The scale was there. It was just indirect. Yara closed the terminal fully and set it aside. A legend shapes events beyond itself. She had said that. She had believed it. She still did. But now, the definition felt incomplete. She moved to the small observation window built into the far wall of her quarters. The same endless field of distant light stretched beyond it. She stood there for a long moment, thinking, reconstructing, not from assumption, but from data. Somewhere in the station, that man was moving through the same corridors as everyone else. Unnoticed, unremarked, carrying a record that did not match the way the system chose to present him. And for the first time in a long while, Yaracel found herself not arriving at a conclusion, but moving toward one. The war strategy seminar was already in progress when Aaron entered. He had chosen a seat along the outer row, high enough to see the entire chamber, but far enough that no one needed to acknowledge his presence. The room was fuller than usual, not just cadets this time, but senior officers as well. Observers, analysts, individuals whose experience carried weight even when they said nothing. At the front, the central display was active. A system map rotated slowly in 3-dimensional space, marked with layers of movement, collapse points, and failed coordination lines. The Battle of Karen Divide, the instructor said. A primary example of coalition breakdown under pressure. Aaron settled into stillness. He knew the name. Everyone did. It was taught as failure, a case study in what happens when command structures fracture and units lose cohesion faster than they can recover it. The coalition had gone into that engagement with superior numbers, superior technology, and a fully coordinated command structure. 72 hours later, the engagement had collapsed. The first 18 hours had determined the outcome. Most who studied it focused on what had gone wrong at the top. Very few asked what had happened at the bottom. At the front row, Commander Reth Vorn sat slightly forward, his posture attentive. Beside him, senior officers observed in silence. You will analyze the failure points, the instructor said. Not as historians, as decision-makers. She paused. Commander Vorn. Vorn moved to the center with the same controlled presence he carried in every setting. No wasted motion. He looked at the room first, then began. The failure began before the first engagement, he said. Positioning placed the coalition at a reactive disadvantage. When the flanking maneuver occurred, there was no unified response protocol. His hand moved once, and the display adjusted. Keynotes lit up. Communication delays compounded the issue. Units began withdrawing based on incomplete information. Not incorrect, just incomplete. He stepped slightly to the side. The moment cohesion breaks, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult. Every decision after that point is made under degraded awareness. His analysis continued for several minutes. Precise, structured, complete. He identified the errors, outlined the alternatives, mapped the exact points where different choices could have altered the outcome. When he finished, the room was silent. Not uncertain. Absorbing. The instructor inclined her head. "Thank you, Commander." Vorn returned to his seat. Then, from the middle rows, a voice spoke. "Admiral." It wasn't loud, but it carried. Not because of volume, because of direction. Every head in the chamber turned. Toward the back. Toward the outer row. Toward the man in gray. The cadet who had spoken leaned forward slightly, his expression composed but edged with something sharper. A challenge dressed as curiosity. "You were present at Karen Divide," he said. "Correct." A pause. Not long. Just enough. The man in gray set his cup of water down on the armrest beside him. "I was," he said. His voice was the same as before, calm, unforced. But in this room, with this many people listening, it landed differently. A few cadets shifted. Others remained completely still. At the front, Vorn's posture changed, just slightly. Not tension, awareness. "Then perhaps," the cadet continued, "you can clarify the role human units played in the collapse of the left flank." The phrasing was careful, but not neutral. The man in gray did not stand. He remained where he was, seated at the back, requiring the entire room to turn toward him, not toward authority, but toward position. There was something deliberate in that, something that didn't announce itself. "I was assigned to a ground unit on the left flank," he said. "I can describe what happened from that position." The instructor gave a single nod. "Proceed." The room settled. The initial engagement followed the expected pattern. Coalition forces held position. The flanking maneuver disrupted that. The display shifted slightly, as if aligning itself with his perspective. Communication failed early. Some units received retreat orders. Others did not. A pause. Most began to withdraw. No judgment in the words. Just fact. The kind of fact that had its own particular weight when spoken by someone who had been standing in it. Our unit did not receive the order. Our communications were compromised. We had two pieces of information. The enemy was advancing, and the position we were holding had not been released. He let that settle. So we stayed. The room did not move. No one spoke. The first 12 hours were defensive. Resource assessment. Position reinforcement using materials already present in the terrain. Rotational rest cycles to maintain operational capacity. No individual held active watch for more than 90 minutes without rotation. You cannot sustain judgment under that kind of pressure without managing the biological cost of it. The display adjusted again. Not dramatically, just enough. By the second day, roughly 30 hours in, it became clear the flank had collapsed beyond our immediate awareness. Enemy pressure increased from multiple directions. We were receiving contact from the north, the northeast, and intermittently from the east. The original defensive geometry was no longer viable. Another pause. This one longer. We had two options. Withdraw into uncertainty, into terrain we had not mapped, toward units we could not reach, without knowing what we would encounter. Or stabilize what remained of the position and make ourselves a problem the opposing force had to account for. His hand moved slightly, almost absent-mindedly. The display highlighted a narrow section of terrain, a ridge line, a choke point, a place that meant nothing to most people in the room. We advanced. A small shift moved through the chamber, barely visible, but there. Not because it was advantageous in the conventional sense, because holding the original position no longer served a purpose, and advancing created a pressure point the opposing force had not planned for. We were not trying to win the flank. We were trying to exist loudly enough that someone would have to respond to us. His tone did not change. The steadiness of it was its own kind of weight. We held the new position for approximately 19 hours. During that time, the opposing force redirected elements from two other sectors to address what they apparently assessed as a larger threat than we actually represented. 11 personnel, against what field assessment later estimated at between 200 and 240 enemy combatants responding to our position across those 19 hours. The display flickered, recalibrated. On the third day, he said, coalition units began reorganizing. When they identified that a position still existed on the left flank, that someone was still there, recovery became possible. It gave them an anchor, not a victory. An anchor. Silence. Complete. The engagement is recorded as a failure, he said. In the first phase, that is accurate. Coalition cohesion collapsed. Command broke down. Units withdrew on incomplete information, and the flanking maneuver succeeded faster than it should have. A brief pause. In the final phase, it was a controlled withdrawal built around a position that should not have existed. 11 people held a point that changed the geometry of the collapse. Not enough to reverse it. Enough to prevent it from becoming a rout. He leaned back slightly. The distinction matters. He said nothing else. No conclusion. No emphasis. Just the information, placed in the room like an object on a table, for anyone who wanted to pick it up. The room remained still. Not because they didn't understand. Because they did. At the front, one of the senior officers shifted in his seat. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his full height, turned, and faced the back of the room. His hand moved to his chest, forming a gesture that carried weight far beyond the motion itself. A recognition. Not announced. Not explained. Given. The man in gray inclined his head once. Acknowledgement. Nothing more. Then he reached for his cup, lifted it, and took a small, quiet sip. The display at the front continued its slow rotation. But the room was no longer the same. The seminar ended, but the room did not immediately recover. Cadets remained in their seats longer than usual, not speaking, not moving with the easy certainty that had defined every session before. Conversations, when they began, were quieter, measured, as if everyone was aware that something had shifted and had not yet decided how to move around it. Aaron stood with the rest, gathering his data slate without urgency. Across the chamber, Commander Reth Vorn had not moved. He remained seated for several seconds after the dismissal, his hands resting on the surface in front of him, his gaze lowered, not in defeat, not in confusion, but in the particular kind of calculation that happens when a structure you trusted no longer aligns with the reality in front of you. Around him, other cadets rose and filtered out. The man in gray had already returned to stillness, as if nothing of significance had occurred. Vorn did not look back. Not yet. He exhaled slowly, then stood. The motion was controlled, as everything about him was. To anyone not watching closely, he would have appeared unchanged. But there was a difference. Small, precise, real. He did not rejoin the group that naturally formed around him. They approached, as they always did, junior officers, cadets who had followed his analysis throughout the week, expecting continuation, reinforcement, the same confident expansion of ideas that had defined him. Vorn acknowledged them briefly, then stepped past. Not dismissive, just elsewhere. The corridor outside was more crowded than before, but the noise felt muted. Conversation started and stopped quickly. He didn't contradict the record. One cadet said quietly. No, another replied. He completed it. That distinction lingered. Vorn moved through the corridor without engaging. His mind was not on where he was going. It was on what he had missed. 14 ground engagements. That had been his number. Spoken earlier with certainty, not as a boast, but as a fact that defined experience. He knew what those engagements had required. Coordination, adaptability, decision-making under pressure. He knew what the numbers meant. And now, against that, 11 personnel, 200 to 240 opposing combatants across 19 hours, redirected from 2 other sectors, all drawn toward a position that had no right to still exist. The total opposing force responding to that position across those 19 hours was larger than anything Vorn had faced with full coalition support at his back. The calculation did not resolve the way it should have. Vorn slowed. He replayed the seminar in sequence. Not the words. The structure. The tone. The absence of emphasis where emphasis would normally exist. The man had not presented his actions as exceptional. That was the part that did not align. He turned into a quieter corridor, one that led toward the observation wing. He stopped. Fully. One hand rested lightly against the wall beside him, not for support, but as a point of contact. Something steady while his thoughts recalibrated. He had made an assumption. Not once. Repeatedly. Based on available data, on visible indicators, on the structure the Academy reinforced every day. Efficiency. Scale. Recognition. He had seen a man without those markers and assigned him a position accordingly. Administrative. Peripheral. Irrelevant to operational discussion. The conclusion had been efficient. It had also been wrong. Vorn closed his eyes briefly. Not in frustration. In acknowledgement. There was no one here to witness it. No audience to perform for. Just the quiet, internal shift of something being corrected, the particular discomfort of a mind adjusting to a truth it should have seen sooner. He straightened. When he opened his eyes again, the corridor felt different. Not because it had changed, but because the way he moved through it had. He pushed off the wall and continued forward. The observation deck was nearly empty. The station had shifted into its quieter cycle, and most of the cadets were elsewhere. Here, there was only the soft ambient hum of the station and the wide, uninterrupted view of the stars beyond the curved glass. He was exactly where Vorn expected him to be, standing near the far end of the deck, hands at his sides, posture relaxed but unmoving, not watching anything in particular. Vorn slowed as he approached, not out of hesitation, out of intention. The distance closed in silence. The man did not turn immediately, but there was a slight shift in his stance, a small acknowledgement that he was no longer alone. Vorn stopped beside him, leaving a measured space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The stars stretched out in front of them, vast and indifferent. "I was wrong," Vorn said. He didn't look at him when he said it. The words were direct, unadorned, no justification attached. The man in gray remained still, his gaze forward. "You didn't have the information." "I had enough," Vorn replied. "I chose the wrong conclusion." That hung there. The man considered it for a second, then gave a small nod. "That happens." The simplicity of the response was not what Vorn had expected. He turned slightly, studying him now. "You were dismissed." "Repeatedly." "By me?" "By others." "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "No." A brief pause. Vorn exhaled slowly. "Why?" The man shifted his weight slightly. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything. It would have corrected the assumption. It would have replaced one assumption with another," he said. "Not the same thing as understanding." Vorn frowned slightly. "You're saying it didn't matter." "I'm saying the timing mattered." That landed. Vorn looked back out at the stars, letting the words settle. "If you had spoken in that room," the man continued, "you would have listened. You would have processed it as information, filed it alongside everything else you already believed." A pause. "It wouldn't have changed you." Vorn didn't respond immediately, because he knew that was true. It sat in his chest uncomfortably. The recognition that he had been exactly the kind of audience who could hear something extraordinary and reduce it to a data point. "What happened in the seminar wasn't information," the man said. "It was context." Vorn let out a quiet breath. "You waited." "Yes." "For what?" "For you to be ready to see it." The words were calm, not condescending, not instructive, just stated, with the same tone he had used to describe rotational rest cycles and redirected enemy combatants. As if this, too, were simply a fact about how things worked. Vorn thought about the training hall, the laughter, the way he had categorized Aaron's story without effort. He thought about reaching past the man beside him without acknowledgement, the casual certainty he had carried into every room, the comfort of a framework that had always held before. "I fought in 14 ground campaigns," Vorn said after a moment. "Each one with full coordination, full access to command structure, support at every level." He paused. 11 personnel against 240. No communications for the first 30 hours. Holding a position that had no business holding. The numbers felt different now. Not abstract. Not theoretical. Real. The way a thing becomes real when you stop calculating it and start feeling the weight of it. "Why isn't any of that in the standard records?" Vorn asked. "Some of it is," the man said. "Just not in a way that draws attention." "That's deliberate." "Yes." "Why?" The man was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something beneath the steadiness, something that had been there a long time and had stopped needing to announce itself. "Because scale is easier to understand than endurance," he said. "One is visible. The other isn't. A fleet of 600 ships, neutralized without a weapon fired, that is visible. 11 people, holding ground for reasons no one would ever fully record. That is something else." Vorn's gaze narrowed slightly. "That doesn't make it less important." "No," the man agreed. "It just makes it harder to measure." The silence returned. But it was different now, heavier, full, like a room after something irrevocable has been said. Vorn shifted his stance, his posture less rigid than it had been at any point since he entered the academy. "You were treated poorly here," he said after a while. "By me included." The man turned his head slightly, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. "Accepted," he said. No emphasis. No wait. No invitation to continue. Just the word, closed and complete, like a door that had been firmly but quietly shut. Vorn nodded once. Slowly, they stood there for a while longer, both facing the same view. Two different paths, two different understandings, now aligned at the same point. After a time, Vorn spoke again. Are all humans like this? He asked. The question was not casual. It carried something behind it, a genuine recalibration. The kind of question you only ask when the old answer no longer fits. The man considered it, longer than he had considered any of the previous questions. His gaze remained on the stars, on that enormous, patient darkness that held its positions regardless of what happened in the rooms beneath it. No, he said finally. We're not without fear or failure. We have both in full measure. He paused. But there's a point, he continued, where difficulty stops being a reason to withdraw. For most, pressure increases the instinct to stop, to preserve what's left, to find the edge of what's possible and stop just before it. A slight shift of his gaze toward the stars. For us, at a certain point, it does the opposite. Vorn listened. Completely. We don't continue because we expect to win, the man said. We continue because stopping isn't an option we accept. Not because we're fearless. Not because we don't feel the weight of it. But because there's something in us that looks at the weight, looks at it fully, without flinching, and decides to carry it anyway. And we don't know how to explain that to anyone who hasn't felt it themselves. The words were quiet, but they were the truest thing that had been said in that station since Aaron Vale had stepped down from a platform to the sound of laughter. Vorn looked out at the stars again, at the scale of them, at the distance, at the indifference, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, for the first time in a long time, he understood something he hadn't known he was missing. Not information, not strategy, not data, perspective. He nodded once more, not to the man beside him, to the realization itself. They stood there in silence after that. No more questions. None were needed. The stars remained unchanged. But the way he saw them, and the way he would see the people who moved through the dark spaces between them, was not. The assembly hall was filled before the ceremony began. Rows of cadets stood in formation, each species arranged according to their own tradition but aligned within the same structure. The high ceiling arched overhead, lined with banners and insignias representing campaigns, victories, and histories that stretched far beyond any one generation. Light filtered down evenly across the chamber. Nothing dramatic, nothing excessive, everything precise. Aaron stood in the third row from the front, his posture straight, his gaze forward. Around him, the low murmur of final adjustments moved through the formation. To his left, the other human cadet shifted slightly, then went still. Across the hall, Commander Reth Vorn stood among the senior cadets. He was not speaking. His focus was forward, but it moved, once, briefly, toward the section where the human cadets stood, then returned. At the back of the hall, near the elevated seating reserved for observers, the man in gray was already standing. Not because anything had begun, because he had chosen to. The ceremony opened without delay. Names were read in sequence, each one carrying its own acknowledgement of completion. Different species responded in different ways, some with stillness, some with gestures unique to their culture, some with quiet vocal affirmations. Then the instructor reached the human section. Cadet Aaron Vale. Aaron stepped forward. And then, without discussion, without agreement, without any signal passing between them, the human cadets rose. One, then the next, then all of them. They did not look at each other. They did not need to. It was simply what they did. When one stood, they all stood. The movement was small at first, contained, but it did not stop there. In the front row, one of the senior officers shifted, then stood, not abruptly, not to draw attention, simply stood, as if it were the only reasonable thing to do in that moment, and he had finally recognized it. Beside him, another followed. A second later, Commander Reth Vorn rose to his full height. He did not look around. He did not wait to see if anyone else would move. He had already decided, somewhere in that corridor, standing against a wall with his eyes closed, and something being corrected inside him. Across the hall, Yarosel stood, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But her decision was clear, made not in this moment but the night before, in the dim light of her quarters, reading 3 service records that had no emphasis, no recognition, and outcomes that had changed the shape of things for thousands of people who would never know why. The shift spread, not as a reaction, as recognition. Row by row, section by section. Cadets who had sat in that same hall days earlier and laughed without hesitation now stood in silence. Their understanding no longer dependent on what was visible, on what had been measured, on what the system had chosen to record and reward. No command was given, no instruction passed, and yet the entire room came to its feet. Aaron stood at the front, the weight of the moment settling around him like something he had been carrying for a long time and had finally been allowed to set down, not because it was gone, but because others had finally reached over and taken part of it. He did not look surprised. He did not look for confirmation, because this was not new to him. Not the standing up, not the recognition, not the slow arrival of understanding in people who had possessed the intelligence to see but lacked the information to look. It was simply seen now. At the back of the hall, the man in gray remained where he was. For a brief moment, something moved behind his eyes. Not pride, not satisfaction, something quieter, something that had waited a long time to arrive and did not need the room to understand it. Something that had been forged in 12-person units and 7-day holds and 43 minutes of keeping something from breaking while the world tried to fall apart, and had never once asked to be recognized for it, because it had never depended on that. The names continued. The ceremony moved forward, but the shift remained, unspoken, complete. And as the final acknowledgments were given and the formation began to dissolve, the room carried that understanding with it. The room had caught up.